Trolley Yesterday by John Bellairs. Chapter 9. The sword dropped from the professor's numb fingers and clattered to the stone floor of the church. He backed away toward the circle of torchlight and stood tensely waiting. After a few minutes he heard the sound of a boat's keel grating on the gravelly beach. Torches flared among the trees, but there was no jingle of armor or tramp of iron-shod feet. Finally a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and grim-looking and wore a shirt of chainmail that reached to his knees. Over his armor he wore a sleeveless shirt of coarse white cloth with a large red cross stitched on its front, and a long sword hung from a belt around his waist. Quickly the man stepped over the threshold, and behind him came another and another and another, 12 in all. The silent warriors formed a ring around the three travelers. The torches flared yellow and smoky, and the professor could smell the burning pitch that the sticks of wood had been dipped in. And as he glanced from one soldier to another, the professor saw that their faces were worn and scarred and blurry, as if the men were statues that had endured the wind and weather of several hundred years. After a brief pause, one of the soldiers stepped forward. He was tall and dignified, and he had a well-trimmed gray beard. Around his neck hung a golden chain from which a jeweled cross dangled. Quickly the man glanced down, and then he turned to the professor. "Your friend is very ill," he said in a deep, grave voice. "He will have to come with us. You may come too if you wish." The professor looked down with a shock as he realized that Johnny was lying stiff and still on the floor of the church. What had happened? Was the cut infected, or... As if in answer to the professor's thoughts, the bearded man spoke again. "The sword that cut him was anointed with poison. We may be able to help, but we must go away from here." Again the professor was stunned. How did this man know that Johnny had been cut by a sword? But before he could say anything, two soldiers stepped forward and gently picked Johnny up, carrying him between them. They moved out through the doorway of the church. The leader motioned with his hand, and the professor and Fergie followed, as if they were hypnotized. On the door and down to the beach they went. Out the door and down to the beach they went, to the place where the long ship stood waiting. As before, it was surrounded by a halo of gray moonlight, though the sky was overcast and rain still fell. The two soldiers who carried Johnny laid him on a bed of fir boughs in the stern of the ship. The professor and Fergie clambered aboard with the others. Then the men shoved at the prow, and the ship slid back out into the water. The furled sail was raised, and instantly a wind started to blow, and the ship began to glide through the dark water. One man held the tiller at the stern, while the others stood still as statues along the sides of the vessel. Fergie and the professor made their way to the prow. They squatted on the damp boards and watched the high carved prow of the ship rise and fall with the waves. Finally the professor spoke in a hoarse voice. "This is very strange, Byron," he said as he glanced furtively over his shoulder. "These men are dressed like soldiers who lived 200 years before the time we are in. They look like crusaders. To be more specific, they look like Templars." Fergie's eyes opened wide. He knew the Templars were an order of monks who were also knights and warriors. "Templars, huh?" he muttered. "Well, what are they doing here? And where are they taking us?" The professor shrugged. He was afraid of these strange, silent men, but he had a feeling that they would not harm him or his friends. And if Johnny was as ill as he looked, they would need all the help they could get to make him better. "I wonder if I brought any gauze bandages along," thought the professor. With a jolt, he realized that he had left his valise and sword back in the church. He sighed helplessly. Things really were out of his hands now, and he and the others would just have to go along and see what happened. The ship drove on through the dark night. The trip seemed to take forever, and the professor wound up reciting all that he could remember of the Iliad in classical Greek. Fergie was silent, but he kept glancing anxiously toward the back of the boat, where Johnny lay. At last the darkness lightened to gray, and a yellowish dawn grew in the eastern sky. Up ahead rose a tall, humped island. At first it was just a purplish shadow rising from the sea, but as they drew closer, Fergie and the professor found that they were staring up at a high hill covered with dark, gloomy cypress trees. Between the clumps of trees stood white stone buildings that looked like tombs and rose up the sides of the hill, their dark doorways staring down like the eyes of skulls. At the top of the hill stood a circular stone fortress with battlements and narrow loophole windows. The whole place looked very forbidding, and there was no sign of any living person anywhere. In silence the ship sailed part way around the island, and then it plunged into a deep rocky crevice. The sail was furled, and the ship coasted into a small, still lagoon that was sheltered by towering walls of limestone. Sand grated under the ship's keel, and the leader of the knights motioned for everyone to get out. 2 soldiers carried Johnny up a winding staircase that was cut into the rock, and the others followed in single file. Last came the professor and Fergie, who felt more than ever that they had wandered into some very strange dream from which they might never awake. At the top of the stairs, the walls of the fortress and the line of silent soldiers marched into the building through the open doorway. Fergie and the professor found that they were in a cavernous, high-ceilinged chamber with a large fireplace at one end. A bright fire fought against the chill of early morning, and, to their surprise, they saw that a bed had already been prepared for Johnny. With great care, the soldiers placed Johnny on the bed and drew a fur coverlet over him. Then, as the soldiers stood by like an honor guard, the leader of the knights knelt by Johnny's side and placed his hand on his forehead. He began to pray, and the words rose and fell like an incantation. Awkwardly, the professor and Fergie looked on. They felt out of place here, and they felt very hungry, since they had not eaten since early the night before. But it did not seem right to ask for food while these men were trying to save Johnny's life, so they said nothing. A soldier approached and laid his hand on the professor's arm. The professor shuddered because the hand was cold as ice. "You may eat now," said the soldier, and he gestured toward a table at the far end of the room. Like a pair of clumsy children, the professor and Fergie followed the man to the table and sat down. The food was very plain, just cheese and bread, but the 2 of them felt that it was the best meal that they had had in a long time. For the first time in many hours they began to feel optimistic. Suddenly they felt incredibly drowsy, and it occurred to them that they had not had much sleep. They slumped forward with their heads on the rough wooden table. Many hours later, Fergie and the professor awoke. The reddish light of late afternoon streamed in through a high window and hovered on the rough stone walls. The soldiers were gone. At the far end of the room, Johnny lay motionless on his bed by the fire. Alarmed, the professor shook himself awake and got up. Had all this kindness and hospitality been a trick to put them off their guard? Had the leader of the knights been working for Johnny's death instead of helping him? As he rushed to the bedside, the professor saw that Johnny lay very still, and his face was deathly pale. Then, to his very great relief, he heard Johnny groan in his sleep, and he saw his chest rise and fall. "He's alive, isn't he?" said Fergie, who was right beside the professor. The professor nodded, and tears trickled down his cheeks. Inside his head, he heard a voice that said, "You can do no good here." And then he looked up and saw the leader of the knights standing near him. The man's eyes were kindly, but his mouth was curled into an amused smile. "Go out and enjoy the island," he said softly. "Evening is drawing on, and this place is beautiful at night. The night air will do you good." The professor was awed and a bit frightened by this man, but he had to ask a question. Is Johnny going to live?" The knight looked grave. He stared for a long time at the pale form that lay on the bed. "Ask me in an hour's time," he said. "In the meantime, please go outside. You are not helping him by kneeling here." Reluctantly, the professor and Fergie turned and walked out through the stone archway and down a short flight of cracked, weathered steps. The sun was setting, and shadows deepened under the cypress trees that grew everywhere on the island. A night wind began to blow. It stirred the trees and made an eerie whispering sound, and Fergie and the professor imagined that they heard voices talking of sorrows long past and bitter griefs that still stung the heart. They walked on, and finally stopped outside one of the strange white tomb-like buildings that they had seen from the ship. Up close, the gaping black doorway seemed even more forbidding than it had seemed from a distance. Fergie and the professor hurried on past another white tomb and another and another. Finally, out of breath, they stopped at a place where the path looked out across the darkening sea. "Prof?" said Fergie anxiously. What is this place, anyway?" "It is the Isle of the Dead," said the professor grimly. He didn't know why he said this. The words just came floating into his brain. "As for those strange silent nights," he went on, "they are ghosts. Long ago, when they came, they were alive. They are part of the Crusader army that in 1204 looted and burned Constantinople out of pure greed. Now they are being punished, it seems. Their spirits haunt this place." Fergie was thoroughly frightened by now. Are they going to kill us?" he asked in a faltering voice. The professor shook his head. No, I'm pretty sure they are trying to help us. Perhaps if they perform enough good acts, their spirits can rest. I certainly hope they can help us. By God, I hope so. The professor swallowed hard, and he tried to choke down a sob. He was thinking of Johnny. After a few minutes, they turned and walked back up the path. They did not know if an hour had passed, but they did not want to wander about any more on this weird island. Far above, at the top of the path, they saw the arch lit by flickering firelight. When they finally got to the entrance, they saw a strange scene. All the knights were standing in a circle around Johnny's bed, and the leader was kneeling by him with a small bronze bowl in his hand. He dipped his fingers in the bowl and smeared something that looked like ointment on Johnny's forehead. Again and again, the sound of praying rose into the high roof of the chamber. Fergie and the professor stood in the doorway a long time as if they were stone statues. They did not move as they watched the strange, solemn ritual go on. At last the chanting stopped. The leader of the knights rose and walked to the doorway. Fergie and the professor could see that his face was sad. They braced themselves for the bad news that was probably coming. How is he?" asked the professor in a weak, quavering voice. The leader shook his head. "Not good. Not good at all. The poison is a strong one, and I cannot fight it much longer. If your friend is to live, a greater power than ours will be needed." The professor stared. "For heaven's sake, tell me what to do!" he exclaimed vehemently. "Johnny is my dearest friend in all the world, and I don't want him to die!" The leader gazed long and hard at the professor. "You must take him to Constantinople. Near the great church of the Holy Wisdom is a smaller church that holds the most sacred picture in all Byzantium. It is called the Hoggetgritia, and its power is much greater than ours. You must press the young man's hand to the Madonna's face in the painting. If he lives till you get there, the Hoggetteria may save him." The professor thought of the Turkish army that was gathering outside the great walled city. He thought of the Turkish ships that were patrolling the waters near the city's harbors. "How on earth am I going to get into the city?" he exclaimed in despair. "I'd need a Sherman tank, and I'm afraid I didn't bring one with me. Can you take us through one of the gates?" The leader shook his head gravely. "No. We did great wrong to the city many years ago, and we may not enter it, but we can bring you to the gates and help you to enter." The leader paused and gazed deep into the professor's eyes. "Believe me," he said solemnly, "I would not send you and your friends into danger if there was any other way. But there is not. You must go if your young friend is to live." And that's the end of Chapter 9.